This is our limited series, Ask an RD, inside the Dr. Shannon Show, where we ask registered dietitians some of your most pressing nutritional questions. I'm Dr. Shannon. Welcome to the show. Hello, everyone. Today we've got Hope Brandt. She's a registered dietitian back for another Ask an RD. Today we are talking about the difference between table sugar and sugar alternatives like Splenda versus monk fruit. What are the differences and how do these different sugars affect our bodies?
Okay, this is such a hefty topic, but I think it's so important because there's so much information flying around about all of these different options. And first and foremost, I think it really does come down to knowing that a lot of it is personal preference based on what your priorities are and what your goals are. So let's just start there. There is no evil wrong answer. There is no superior right answer. We can just look at them in the context of our diet, our goals, and our preferences. Another overarching theme is just kind of reduction of the intake of all of these items, regardless of if it is a natural sweetener, a nutritive sweetener, a non-nutritive sweetener, an artificial sweetener. We kind of just want to look at the reduction of these items in our diet anyway. They shouldn't be a huge contributor to any portion of our intake, either macronutrient or micronutrient. Okay, so just laying the groundwork there.
Yes, love it.
But when we're looking at sweeteners, there's kind of two big categories. So we're looking at nutritive versus non-nutritive sweeteners, which means nutritive adds calories or energy to your diet. So these are the sweeteners that do contain carbohydrates. We also have non-nutritive sweeteners, which do not contain calories. They don't add energy to your diet. They just add the flavor of sweetness, and they pass through your digestive tract. So the big difference between these is how they affect your blood sugar. All carbohydrates are broken down into a monosaccharide called glucose in our body. So if a sweetener has carbohydrates, it has caloric content, it will be broken down into sugar in our bloodstream, which will then raise our blood sugar. Non-nutritive sweeteners do not contribute carbohydrates to our diet, which means they do not directly affect our blood sugar. So if that is the thing that you are concerned about, if that is the thing that you're looking to maybe control a little bit more or make a choice that would help your family control blood sugar, if you're living maybe with a spouse who has prediabetes or your parents are in a position where they have prediabetes or diabetes, switching to a non-nutritive sweetener could help with controlling blood sugar. Again, it shouldn't be something that is, we're eating huge amounts of foods with non-nutritive sweeteners, but it absolutely can make a difference in your blood sugar state after you consume those foods. The other big kind of category difference is artificial sweeteners versus natural sweeteners. And so again, this comes down to personal preference and looking at the total intake in your diet. Things that are naturally occurring and add sweetness, things like honey, maple syrup, agave. These are nutritive sweeteners, so they add calories, they add carbohydrates to our diet, they have an effect on our blood sugar. But if you're eating them in a context where it is a reduced amount and or it's in the presence of fat or protein, then it's not something to be super up in arms about. They can add a very marginal amount of micronutrients to our diet. So, you could get some minerals if you chose maple syrup over table sugar. But they still both the same way break down into glucose in our bloodstream and have a very, very, very similar effect on our blood sugar. So it's not really going to make a difference in that sense. It really comes down to your personal preference, how much of it you're eating, what's accessible to you, and you make that personal decision.
It's so interesting because I feel like table sugar gets a worse reputation than like honey or maple syrup, but you're saying there's not really a huge difference.
There's not really a huge difference other than the fact that sucrose is man-made. It is a glucose and a fructose molecule put together to make sucrose, which is table sugar. And then maple syrup is just a naturally occurring sweetener.
Okay, so is there any downside of this man-made molecule? Because I think like the process, because you're saying table sugar is basically more
refined.
It's refined. Yes. So the effects on like our brain and our body, is there really a big difference, or is this kind of like hype? And
I think personally that it is mostly hype. However, with the current environment that we're in, people are eating a lot more than the recommended amount of sugar. So if we are eating a lot more than the recommended intake, it's going to have a bigger impact on the results that we're seeing, right? So that's why I think first line defense is literally decreasing the amount of added sugar that you are consuming, whether or not it is natural or artificial.
Yeah.
Then from that point, it really should have a very, very limited effect on any type of contribution to your diet from that point. Because if we're consuming just a few grams of added sugar per day, it's not going to have a huge effect on any result that we're seeing, right? So that's a good thing. We don't have to be freaky about the type of sweeteners or sugar that we're adding to our diet if the first priority is just reduction overall. And a lot of times it's like choosing the type of sweetener we want to add to our coffee on a daily basis, right? And so it's probably a tablespoon, maybe a couple tablespoons at most, which in the context of your diet overall is a very, very small amount of your overall intake. And especially if it's in the context where you're drinking a latte, if you have milk, which is protein and fat a lot of times, or maybe it's just cream in your coffee, which is fat, that's also going to impact and reduce the blood sugar effect that sweetener is going to have as well.
Yeah. What is the recommended amount in grams of sugar per day?
So it's 6 to 10% of your daily intake, which honestly, in my opinion, I think is still a little bit high. That gives us about 100 to 200 calories of your diet being from sugar, and that's 25 to 50 grams of added sugar, right? Not just sugar in general, because we're going to consume sugar in the form of other carbohydrates, right? So all carbohydrates that we eat break down into sugar in our body. This is the recommendation for added sugar specifically, 25 to 50 grams per day.
Okay, which really is not very much.
It's not very much. It equates to 100 to 200 calories of your overall diet if you're eating around 2,000 calories a day.
Okay, that's really helpful. This idea that sugar is addictive. Number one, is that true? Or makes you hungrier or makes you crave it more? Number one, is that true? And number two, is there a difference between like table sugar versus like what did you call it?
Artificial or
artificial or non-artificial sugars.
Okay, so yes, artificial sweeteners can be up to like 700 times sweeter than normal table sugar. This absolutely can affect your perception of taste. It can affect your appetite, your cravings, and just your taste perception of sweetness in general. So it's just important, again, to look at it in the context of your diet and be very honest with how much you're consuming these types of foods. And looking at, there are ways to reduce your intake and crowd your diet more with fruits and vegetables that can help more so kind of regulate your taste so that when you taste an apple, it tastes sweet to you, right? Which is a big difference. Like if you're consuming artificially sweetened foods on a regular basis, it can affect how you perceive the sweetness of foods that aren't as high on that kind of sweetness scale. So that's absolutely a factor to look at. And again, in that instance, we're just looking at reduction of those artificial sweeteners throughout our diet, throughout our day. That can absolutely affect your behavior around food as well. If those are the type of foods that you like to reach for, if you're looking for that sweetness. And again, it comes down to your goals and your diet and knowing the effect that different sweeteners truly have in moving the needle toward whatever goal that you have. For a lot of people, switching out nutritive sweetener options like regular sodas for diet sodas can be an extremely helpful swap for looking at reducing calorie intake to produce a deficit to see weight loss. There can be instances where switching to an artificial sweetener has a positive effect. But still, the bottom line is we don't want these things to be making up a huge part of our intake.
Yeah. If someone is looking at a label, how do they know, how can they read it and decode how much sugar is in it and what ingredients should they look for that tell us if there's additive sugar in it or artificial sugars or even just real sugars?
Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at the food label, you will see total carbohydrates and you will see added sugar under that. So look for added sugar content. That's the first thing I would look for is the number on the label. If you want to see what that item is sweetened with, then read the ingredients list. And then there's several different sweeteners that you could see down there, especially whether or not the product is quote unquote sugar-free or like the regular sugar version of that item. So sucrose obviously is a sweetener that you'd see. It's the table sugar. You could see fructose, or for non-nutritive options, that would be like sucralose, anything ending in like all, like OL, that would be a sweetener. And then there's also sugar alcohols, which we have not even touched on yet, which is like a subcategory because technically they do offer some caloric content, but it's much less than normal table sugar. So anything that ends in tol, T-O-L, like xylitol, is a sugar alcohol that could be adding sweetness to that product as well.
Okay. So we're looking to decrease all of these things. Sugar alcohols.
In my opinion, yes. I think pretty much across the board. And that might not speak to everybody's diet. Some people may already have reduced their intake of these items to where it's a very, very tiny contributor to your diet. And in those cases, that's when it comes down to just pure personal preference and what makes sense for you.
Yeah, totally. So let's say there's people at different starting points. Some people have a lot of sugar in their diet. They're maybe drinking sodas and they want to decrease their sugar. And then maybe there's someone that has already, cut out a lot of the sugar in general. And maybe they're not drinking sodas and they have less sugar content overall. Where could these two people start in order to decrease their sugar content?
For sure. Okay, so if we're looking at a person where added sugar is making up more than 10% of their overall intake, we want to look at reducing the amount of calories in your diet that are coming from added sugar. So a lot of times a great first step is choosing a non-nutritive option of that same product. So like you were saying with sodas, if you're drinking Coke, drink Coke Zero or Diet Coke, right? This is not a perfect swap. But if it's going to help someone reduce their added sugar intake and create a better pattern overall, then that is a fantastic first step to start inducing those results that we want to see. And then from that point, still, we're looking at, okay, if we're drinking a soda every day or multiple times a day, let's reduce that to maybe like one a day, and then maybe every other day, right? And then from that point, we don't have to get freaky about like making our diet perfect. Perfect diet doesn't exist. A perfect diet for you can exist, though, that includes the things that are worth it to you, and that help you remain consistent with the overall principles of a healthful diet that we want to see. And so maybe that does look like every now and again, a Coke is totally worth it to you, and you're willing to work that into your overall dietary pattern. Maybe that looks like once you kind of realize the amount of added sugar that that's actually bringing to your diet, it's really just not worth it anymore to you. And so you choose the non-nutritive option, the Diet Coke or the Coke Zero instead. Or maybe it comes down to the point where it's like you've realized none of it is really floating your boat anymore, and you're choosing water or sparkling water or something like that instead. So there's absolutely a sliding scale based on where you're starting, where you want to go, and then what is actually like worth it and enjoyable to you in your diet. Because that's a big part of creating a dietary pattern that you're going to be able to be consistent with in the long run. And then for the other example, which is someone who's just looking at reducing like artificial sweeteners or added or non-nutritive sweeteners in your diet. I think it comes down to looking at diet quality overall, because many times it's going to be the packaged or ultra-processed foods that bring those elements into our diet. And so those are foods that we want to look at reducing to pretty much anyway, just across the board. And so looking at raising your diet quality and, again, crowding your diet with fruits and vegetables and protein items that fall a little bit more on the lower processed scale versus the highly processed or ultra processed scale.
I'll give someone an example in case they feel like they fall into this camp, and you tell me your thoughts on this. So I was eating, just from convenience, like at least one protein bar a day, sometimes like 3 a day, like so many protein bars. Yeah. And I saw them as like a snack. I saw them as dessert. Because they kind of satisfy that sweet.
Yeah, for sure.
And sometimes like breakfast on the go with some fruit, like if I'm running out of the house. And I have since, and I would get the Costco kind that I love. So I would have a bunch of them. And I've since switched to having protein powder, the Just Ingredients protein powder that has like a real fruit in it, and it doesn't have added sugars in it. And I feel a huge difference in my cravings for sugar, especially at the end of the day. So it's still just as convenient for me to switch to just, protein powder in my water shaken up as it is to grab the protein bar. But I feel like that swap for me has made a huge difference. And I don't know if there's any like science to that. I mean, you could explain that, but I feel like that might be an example of how you don't have to decrease the convenience at all.
Yes.
You can just kind of like go towards one product that might be a little less highly processed.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think with protein bars and protein powders, they're probably close to the same scale of that, but it is about the ingredients that are in it and what makes sense for you with your goals, with your diet. So if it's looking at, okay, I want to try to reduce my intake of artificial sweeteners, and then just swapping it for a product that has an ingredient list that more so aligns with what you're trying to do. I mean, that's a great example. And I love that it's still just as convenient, right? Because it doesn't make sense to say switch this super convenient option for your diet with this different option. Yeah. And it's like, okay, like you could do that, but it's not apples to apples at that point.
Yeah.
Like it creates way more work for you. Yeah. So I think being honest with what you're doing, what your goals are, and knowing that, again, I'm sure the protein powder is probably sweet. It has some sort of sweetener in it. So it's just a different option. It might be a natural non-nutritive sweetener. So if it's with like stevia or monk fruit or something like that, then that could be an option that's more so aligned with your dietary goals than an artificial non-nutritive sweetener that would be found in like the Costco protein bars.
Because do artificial sweetener, and you may have already answered this, so I'm sorry if you're feeling redundant, but do artificial sweeteners, first of all, an artificial sweetener, give us like a name of an artificial sweetener, like Splenda?
Splenda, Sweet and Low. Yeah.
Okay. Do those affect your behavior around food, your hunger, more than a natural sweetener like the monk fruit?
I don't know of any evidence that points toward that.
Okay.
So, and they're really having the same result for why you would include them in your diet, right? To provide that sweetness that you're looking for. And so much more research is needed around these topics because it's just difficult to truly pinpoint the impact that these individual ingredients have when we're looking at an entire dietary pattern. And the fact that digestion and behavior around food is just so intertwined. And so it's hard to be able to literally like tease out the effects of one thing. But artificial sweeteners can definitely impact your gut microbiome. The true effects of that, whether that is inherently negative, is not known, but it definitely is having some sort of effect.
Right.
So having that in mind as well, and knowing that, again, it's going to be the dose and the amount of exposure that you're having to these items that creates the severity of the impact that you see.
I think this is really clarifying for me because what I'm realizing as you're talking is it's more about decreasing the overall dosage. So going back to the protein versus protein powder, protein bar versus protein powder example, it could just be that the protein powder has less overall sugar versus the protein bar. Even though the sugars are different, it might be less so the difference in sugars and more just the amounts.
Absolutely. Yeah. But that's a great swap if that brings your overall intake lower and aligns with what you're trying to do in your diet.
Yeah.
So and again, that's why this topic is multifaceted, because it really comes down to where the individual is on this scale of looking at added sugar in your diet overall. And then a lot of times, I think it's pretty common knowledge these days that, right, we don't want to have a lot of added sugar in our diets. So then how can we continue to progress if we've already looked at reducing nutritive added sugars, and then we're still looking at trying to improve the quality of our diet by reducing the non-nutritive sweetener intake that we're consuming as well?
Yeah, right. This is extremely clarifying. Thank you so much, Hope.
Thank you.
Yeah, we will see you all in the next episode.